In the middle of Idaho's worst wildfire season, firefighters froze at a sight they never expected to see. Two exhausted bear cubs, trembling and desperate, walking straight toward a lone elephant, begging him for help. No one understood why such fragile little creatures would turn to a giant stranger for safety. But just minutes later, they all witnessed something that would bring millions of people across America to tears. Even after the flames moved on, the clearing in the Idaho mountains still looked like the inside of a burned-out furnace. Blackened stumps reached up like broken fingers, and the ground was a crust of ash and cracked soil. In the middle of that silence stood a single figure that did not belong there at all, an African elephant named Atlas. His skin, once the soft grey of riverstone, was smeared with soot. A torn strip of old leather clung to one shoulder, the ghost of a collar he'd carried for years. He was huge, heavier than any pickup that had ever crawled these logging roads, yet he stood strangely still, as if the whole valley were holding its breath with him. Somewhere down the slope, a branch snapped. Atlas shifted his weight, the earth grumbling under his feet. Smoke dragged low through the trees, bringing with it the dry taste of pine resin and something sharper, like metal. His ears lifted. Whatever was coming toward the clearing was small, frightened, and alone. They appeared at the edge of the burned ground, like two smudges of moving ash. The older cub, Ash, stumbled first, his paws too big for his skinny legs, fur clumped with dust and soot. Behind him, Ember tottered in his brother's tracks, eyes wide and glassy, nose twitching at every bitter scent on the wind. They had been walking for too long, their bellies pinched with a deep, empty ache, tongues thick and dry. The stream they'd tried to find was only cracked mud and flies, and the forest that had always smelled of sap and wet earth now reeked of smoke and things they didn't have words for. All they knew was that nothing felt safe anymore. Ash stopped when he finally saw Atlas. The shape was too big to understand at first, just a grey wall rising out of the haze. Ember bumped into him from behind, gave a tired whine, and then froze too. The thing in the clearing had legs like tree trunks and teeth made of ivory that caught the last scraps of daylight. Every instinct in both cubs told them to turn back into the broken timber, to find a hollow log or a rock ledge, and crawl into it until the world was quiet again, but there was nowhere left to run. Behind them, the trees sloped up into choking smoke. Ahead of them, the stranger waited, towering and silent. Up in the smoky sky above, a distant helicopter thudded past, invisible behind the haze. On its side were the orange letters of Idaho's wildfire crew, but from the ground it was only a low, restless heartbeat in the clouds. Atlas flicked one ear, remembering other machines, other rotors, other cages made of steel and noise. Ash swallowed, throat burning. Then, without really deciding to, he took a step forward. Ember let out a thin, high sound, part complaint and part plea, and followed. Their little bodies shook, but they kept moving, paws sinking into the powdery ash until they stood only a few yards from Atlas's massive feet. Their cries were not bare growls or threats. They were small, broken sounds, the kind every species seems to recognize. A call that said, "We are lost, we are tired, we cannot do this alone." Ember lifted his face, eyes rimmed red from smoke, and stared up at the giant whose shadow fell over both of them. Atlas lowered his head, his trunk tracing a slow curve through the hot air. He could smell them clearly now. Singed fur, old milk, the sour edge of hunger and fear. No herd surrounded him to tell him what to do. No fence forced him forward or back. There was only this moment, these two trembling lives, and the burned earth between them. For a long beat, nothing moved. The helicopter's thump faded. Somewhere far off, a tree finally gave up and collapsed with a soft crash, showering sparks onto the blackened slope. Ash jolted at the sound and shuffled closer to Ember, pressing their shoulders together as if bracing for the giant to turn away. Instead, Atlas shifted his weight toward them. One enormous foot stamped gently into the ash, not as a warning, but as a choice. Dust curled up around his toes. Behind his dark, tired eyes, something old and stubborn stirred something that remembered water and shade, and the simple rule that strength was meant to stand between danger and the small. High above the clearing, the helicopter banked away, its crew unaware of what was unfolding below an elephant alone in the wrong country. 2 bear cubs begging him for something they couldn't name, and a forest holding its breath. One day, people would replay this moment frame by frame. For now, only the mountains watched while Atlas began, slowly, to decide. By the time that summer settled over central Idaho, the mountains had turned the color of old bone. Snowmelt that usually lingered into July had vanished weeks early. Creeks that once braided silver through the valleys were nothing but pale scars in the dirt. The air felt thin and scratchy, as if someone had run sandpaper over the whole sky. Locals said they'd never seen the forest this thirsty. In a shallow den, tucked under a tangle of roots, 2 bear cubs didn't know any of that. To Ash and Ember, the world was still mostly the warm curve of their mother's body and the steady rhythm of her breathing. When she came back smelling of fish or berries, life made sense. When she was gone, they waited, trusting that her shadow would always fall across the mouth of the den before the dark did. Lately, though, the waits had grown longer. Their mother ranged farther down the slope, chasing scents that evaporated before she could reach them. The berry bushes were shriveled, the ground hard where it should have been soft. More than once she returned, with nothing but dust on her muzzle and exhaustion in her eyes, curling around her cubs as if the circle of her body could keep hunger from finding them. Up above their valley, a different kind of circle traced the sky. Grace Walker guided her yellow firefighting helicopter along the ridgeline, eyes flicking from the treetops to the instrument panel and back again. She'd flown over Idaho's forests for years, watching seasons turn, rivers swell, elk migrate. That summer, the green carpets she knew by heart were patchy and brittle, pockmarked with smoke columns where lightning had already started trouble. On the ground at a temporary fire camp near Ketchum, generators hummed and radios crackled in the dust. White trailers and orange water tanks sat under sagging shade tarps. Dana Collins walked between them with a clipboard in one hand and a coffee she'd forgotten to drink in the other. She'd been chasing wildfires across the west for decades, but the early heat and low snowpack had tied a knot in her gut she couldn't quite shake. Maps covered the hood of a truck, marked with coloured lines that meant flame fronts, containment, evacuation zones. Leaning over them, Dr. Noah Reed traced a finger along one ridge. He wasn't part of the fire crew, not exactly. His job was to understand what the flames did to everything that couldn't load into a pickup and drive away. Radio collars, trail cameras, old migration data, they all told him the same thing. Animals were running out of places to go. Back in the den, Ash woke to the sound of his mother shifting her weight. It was late afternoon, heat still pressing against the cool dirt walls. She nuzzled each cub in turn, a quick, firm touch, then slipped out into the narrow slice of light that reached their doorway. Ember blinked after her, tiny claws flexing, a whine catching in his throat before sleep tugged him under again. Night in the drought-stricken forest came dry and noisy. Branches cracked under their own weight. The usual chorus of frogs along the creek was gone, replaced by the faint rasp of insects and the occasional distant pop that might have been a rock or might have been something burning. When dawn finally seeped down the slope, The den was still. Too still. Their mother's scent lingered, but her warmth did not. At first, Ash treated it like any other long hunt. He wrestled Ember, pawed at the roots, chewed on a stick. The light moved across the doorway. Hunger curled and uncurled inside him like a fist. When the shadows stretched long and empty, and their mother still hadn't returned, something unfamiliar slid in beside the hunger, an unease that made him pace from one side of the den to the other. Ears pricked for footsteps that never came. By the time the second sunset painted the ridge in dusty orange, Ember had stopped playing altogether. He lay near the entrance, nose pressed to the dirt, drawing in every scent the evening brought. Old pine, cold rock, a trace of smoke from far away. Once he thought he heard her low huff of greeting and jolted up, only to find nothing but wind. His small body shook, though the air was still hot. High above, Grace's helicopter drummed along its patrol route. From her vantage point she could see where the land pinched into narrow canyons, where deadfall stacked like kindling, where a stray spark could turn last year's needles into this year's headline. She radioed in a cluster of new smoke wisps, then fell quiet, eyes catching on a patch of forest that looked darker than it should, a sign of trees already stressed, already ready to burn. The next morning, Noah stood at the edge of a dry creek bed, hands on his hips, staring at tracks that ended in cracked mud. Deer, elk, something smaller, raccoon, maybe. All of them had come here looking for water that no longer existed. He crouched, touched the dirt, then glanced toward the slope where the bear's den lay hidden among roots and stone. In his head, he added another invisible line to the map. Animals that would soon be desperate enough to go anywhere. Back in the den, the line had already been crossed. Ash nudged Ember with his nose, then with his whole shoulder, until his brother uncurled and blinked at him. The world outside smelled wrong, drier, sharper, touched by a faint, bitter tang of distant smoke. But staying meant waiting for a mother who might never step through that doorway again. Ash braced his paws, took one steadying breath, and stepped out into the light. Ember stumbling after him into a forest that no longer knew how to be kind. Morning on the slope came pale and thin, more light than warmth. Ash blinked into the day, the world outside their den looking bigger than he remembered. Needles and leaves crackled under his paws instead of springing back soft. Ember pressed so close behind him that their shoulders almost moved, as two small bodies trying to fill the space their mother had left. For a moment they just stood there, letting the new air move through their noses. The forest was quieter than it should have been. No steady rush of water from the creek. No sleepy croak of frogs. No splash of something heavy stepping into a pool. Only the dry murmur of wind through branches and the distant, thin pop of something breaking far away. Ash moved first, head low, sniffing for the familiar trail their mother always took. Her scent still clung to the roots and rocks near the entrance, but it faded quickly, eaten away by dust and time. He followed it down the slope, Ember stumbling after, looking back every few steps as if the den might change its mind and call them home. The ground grew rougher as they went. Where soft moss had once covered the forest floor, bare dirt and scattered stones waited now, hot even in the morning. Every few yards Ash stopped, pawing at patches of brown ferns and overturned logs, hoping for berries, grubs, anything. The only taste he found was old bark and grit between his teeth. They reached the path their mother had worn through the undergrowth, a faint tunnel of bent branches and flattened grass. Ash's heart kicked at the sight of it. This was the road she always took and always returned from. He pushed forward faster, Ember panting behind him, hope and hunger pulling them along the same track for the first time without her. The air changed before the landscape did. A heaviness settled on their tongues, something bitter underneath the dry pine. Smoke, thin but present, slid between the trees like a second wind. Ember sneezed and shook his head, looking up with wide, uncertain eyes. Ash hesitated, then kept going. The trail still led this way. Trails, he believed, always led somewhere. By midday, the sun stood high and harsh, turning every bare patch of dirt into a mirror of white heat. The cubs' paws ached, and the fur along their backs clung too warm to their skin. When they finally heard the faint buzz of insects over water, both lifted their heads at once. The sound tugged at something old inside them, a memory of easier days at the creek's edge. They broke out of the trees onto a familiar channel that cut through the valley, but where there should have been cold, running water, there was only a bed of cracked mud and stranded stones. A dragonfly hovered over a shallow, stagnant puddle, no bigger than a dinner plate, wings glinting in the merciless light. Ash stepped down, claws scraping dry earth that should have been cool and soft. He pawed at the mud, digging where the ground looked darkest. Dust rose first, then a smear of damp that gave him hope. Ember dropped beside him, digging too, small paws working desperately. When a thin film of brown water finally pooled in the shallow scrape, both cubs lowered their mouths at once, licking greedily at the bitter taste that barely took the edge off their thirst. Above them, in a sky the colour of faded denim, a shape circled. A golden eagle rode a column of warm air, keen eyes picking out every movement below. The cubs did not see the shadow pass over them twice, 3 times, closer each time. It wasn't until the rush of wings came sharp and sudden that Ash looked up, eyes flashing with a fear he didn't have time to name. The eagle dropped, talons spread, a streak of brown and white against the open blue. Ash reacted without thinking, shoving Ember sideways, throwing his own small body over the shallow scrape of water. Ember tumbled into a tangle of dry grass as the eagle swept so low its wingtip brushed Ash's back, leaving a stinging line of pain and a handful of loose fur drifting in its wake. The bird circled once more, reconsidering, but the cubs were already scrambling for cover. They dove under a half-fallen log, leaning against an old stump, hearts hammering, breath coming in short, sharp bursts. From beneath the shelter of bark and roots, they watched the sky, until the eagle finally gave up and glided away toward easier prey. The world for a minute stayed very still. When the shaking in their legs finally eased, Ash crawled out first. The little puddle they'd dug had already sunk back into the thirst of the ground, leaving only damp streaks on the mud. Ember nosed at it anyway, then licked the fur along his brother's back where the feather had grazed. The touch was clumsy, but it carried a message. We are still here. Afternoon stretched long and unforgiving. Too tired to climb back to the den, too hungry to lie down and sleep, the cubs moved along the dry creek bed, following its twists and turns, in the hope that somewhere, in some shaded bend, water still waited. Overhead, the first thin column of new smoke rose on the horizon, and miles away, radios crackled to life at the fire camp. But down in the empty channel, all Ash and Ember knew was that the only way left was forward. For most of his life, Atlas had known the world as a rectangle. 4 concrete walls, a cracked slab for a floor, and a strip of sky the size of a postcard. The roadside zoo, outside a dusty Texas highway town, called it an African savanna experience. But it smelled more like hot rubber and spilled soda than any savanna he remembered in his bones. Cars came and went. Children pointed, adults checked their phones. Sometimes someone threw popcorn that stuck to his tongue like glue. In summer, the heat bounced off the concrete until the air shimmered. In winter, the north wind knifed straight through the bars. The only constant was the weight of the collar around his neck and the dull ache in his legs from standing on stone. Still, pieces of another life clung to him, the feel of mud squishing under his feet, the taste of clean water pulled straight from a river, the sound of other elephants' low rumbles vibrating through his ribs. At night, when the traffic thinned and the lights dimmed, he would sway and listen for echoes that never answered, trying to remember the last time he had not been alone. It was a small group from a sanctuary in Oregon who finally changed that rectangle. They arrived with clipboards and soft voices, walked the perimeter twice, and frowned at the worn path his feet had carved in the concrete. Their words transfer, rehabilitation, bigger pastures floated over the owner's talk of permits and money. Atlas only understood one thing: the gate would open and the world would get larger. The day they loaded him onto the transport trailer, rain pooled in the ruts of the parking lot. Strange hands guided him up a metal ramp, speaking calmly while the floor clanged under his weight. The trailer smelled of hay and old steel, but there was room to turn, to shift. When the doors closed, he felt the collar tug, then loosen. Somewhere above his head, a latch clicked with finality. The miles rolled by beneath him, unseen but felt in every sway. He learned the rhythm of the highway, the long, straight hum, the slowing and bumping near small towns, the brief stillness at fuel stops. Under the road noise there was another sound, a small, steady faith in the way the sanctuary woman had rested her hand against his cheek and whispered, "We're taking you somewhere better." Big guy. Idaho came with mountains that rose like folded knuckles against the horizon, and air that smelled sharper than the flatlands. The truck laboured up switchbacks, gears grinding. Night came early in those canyons, shadows reaching across the asphalt. Somewhere along a narrow stretch of forest road, a thunderstorm moved in without asking permission, dragging sheets of rain and wind into the path of the convoy. Lightning stitched the sky open. The driver cursed softly, easing around a fallen branch. Atlas shifted to keep his balance as the trailer jolted. One bad bounce, one rotten board, and a bolt somewhere in the frame gave way. The next turn threw his weight sideways. The old door latch, already weakened by years of rust, tore loose with a scream of metal. Cold, wet air exploded into the dark box. For a heartbeat, he froze, trunk lifted to the storm. Freedom was not a concept to him so much as a sensation, space, unscripted and deep. Behind him was the known cage, being pulled toward an unknown pasture. Ahead, through the jagged opening, was wet earth, trees, and night without fences. When the truck slowed at a washout, Atlas stepped toward the gap as if pulled by gravity older than iron, and stepped down into the mud. The world outside was steep and slick. Rain ran in sheets off the embankment, turning dust to slurry. Atlas slid, caught himself, felt real ground fight back under his feet. Branches whipped against his sides. Voices shouted somewhere above, faint under the drum of water and the roll of thunder. He moved away from them, not in anger, but from a long habit of surviving anything with hands and tools. By morning, the storm had blown east, leaving broken branches, wheel ruts, and a wide smear of elephant tracks leading into the timber. The rescue team followed them for a while, calling, searching, radios buzzing with worried updates. But the forest here was thick and folded, valleys tucked into ridges, and the tracks faded where rock began. Eventually, the humans turned back, paperwork already reshaping his story into Lost in Transit. Atlas was not lost, he was learning. In the weeks that followed, he moved mostly at dawn and dusk, testing the new country in cautious circles. The sawtooth forests were not his birthland, but the language of trees and water was one he still understood. He found low, wet pockets where springs seeped out of the rock, felt the subtle coolness of ground that held veins of hidden moisture. He avoided the straight lines, roads that smelled of oil, clearings carved too clean, the whine of chainsaws, the rattle of ATVs, the distant thump of target practice, all told him where not to go. Helicopters, those great metal insects passed overhead more often as summer deepened and smoke crept into the valleys. Whenever their shadows crossed his path, he slipped under the shelter of fir and aspen and waited them out. Some evenings he would stand on a ridge and look down at the small grid of town lights far below. The glow reminded him faintly of the zoo strip, but here no crowd pressed against a fence to stare. Wind brought scents of coffee, diesel, and something fried, but they were background notes under the deeper smell of sun-baked rock and dry grass. Alone had become his default shape in the world, heavy but uncomplaining. Yet, as the drought tightened its grip, even his secret places began to shrink. Springs ran thinner. Mud holes he'd relied on baked into cracked plates. Deer and elk moved nervously, bunching where little water remained. One evening, as Atlas stood over a shallow seep he'd stomped open with his own weight, he lifted his head and caught a new scent on the smoky breeze, sharp with fear, edged with hunger, and threaded with the faint sweetness of something very young. It drifted up from a valley that, until that moment, he had never bothered to visit. By late afternoon, the light over the valley had turned the colour of old brass. Smoke hung in thin sheets between the trees, not enough to choke, just enough to sting. Atlas moved slowly down the slope, following that strange new scent, young, wild, and threaded with panic. Each step left a deep print in the powdery ash. Far below, in the abandoned creek bed, Ash and Ember were running out of forward. Their paws dragged, leaving uneven lines in the dust. The sun had burned the last bit of cool out of the day. Ember's tongue lolled, eyes half-lidded, but whenever he stumbled, Ash bumped him back to his feet with a tired, stubborn nudge. The dry channel bent toward a clearing the fire had chewed through days earlier. Trees ended all at once, replaced by black stumps and open sky. The cubs hesitated at the edge, blinking at the sudden brightness. Nothing out there looked like shelter. Nothing looked like water. But there was no shade left behind them either. Atlas reached the opposite side of that same clearing and stopped. From where he stood, the valley floor was a patchwork of scars, burned ground, fallen trunks, the pale streak of the creek bed. Two small shapes moved along it, slow and uncertain, like bits of ash that had decided not to settle. He watched them climb the last little rise and stop in their tracks. For a long breath, no one moved. The cubs saw a wall of grey towering above the scorched landscape, legs like pillars, tusks dull in the smoky light. Atlas saw two bundles of matted fur with eyes too large for their faces, ribs faintly visible under the soot. The air between them trembled with heat and something else neither side had words for. Ash felt his body pulling in two directions. One way was back into the broken forest, to hide and hope. The other was toward this impossible giant whose scent was unfamiliar but not sharp with blood or rage. Ember made the decision for them, in the end. A thin, cracked sound slipped out of him, part whimper, part question, and his pause carried him forward. Ash followed, because that was what he knew how to do. Together they crossed the open ash, leaving tiny tracks that looked like they could be erased by a single careless breeze. They stopped a few yards from Atlas's front feet, heads tipped back so far their necks trembled. Ember cried again, a little louder this time, the sound frayed around the edges. Atlas lowered his head until his trunk was only a breath above them. He could smell the singed fur, the sour fear, and under it all, the faint sweetness that said they were not long from their mother's milk. His ears lifted, then settled. No herd to ask, no trainer's shout, no fence telling him where he ended and the world began, just a choice. Behind the burned clearing, the creek bed curved away and dropped. Atlas remembered a low spot there, a place where the ground had once felt cool under his feet. He straightened, turned from the cubs, and walked toward it with a deliberate slowness that did not feel like retreat. His shadow slipped off them, then beckoned them to follow. The channel was worse up close, cracked mud, scattered stones, the ghost of old water rings on the banks. Atlas stepped into the center and stood for a moment, feeling. The earth here still held a whisper of damp, not on the surface, but deeper down. He lifted one broad foot and drove it down hard. The ground shuddered, dust jumping in a ring. The first 2 blows only raised more powder. On the third, a hairline fracture spidered through the crust. Atlas shifted his weight and stomped again, his trunk curling to pull loose chunks aside. Darker earth showed beneath the pale dust, then a thin glisten where light caught on something not entirely dry. He dug with the precision of long practice, scooping and scraping, turning a crack into a hollow. Ash watched, mesmerized, as the shallow pit slowly filled. At first it was just a smear, then a trembling skin of brown water seeped in from below. Ember crept down the bank, paws sinking into the softened mud. When Atlas finally stepped back, a small pool quivered where his feet had been. It wasn't much, but to 2 parched cubs, it looked like a miracle. They drank without manners, pushing each other, snuffling, licking every muddy drop. Water streaked their noses and chins, carried with it the taste of rock, roots, and survival. Atlas stood over them, chest rising and falling, listening to the soft, desperate sounds. For the first time in a very long while, he was tired from something that felt right. As the sun slid lower, the wind changed. A thread of sound floated in from the far hills, the distant yipping conversation of coyotes, thin but distinct. Ember froze, ears pricked. Ash lifted his head, sides heaving, and scanned the rim of the Burt channel. The calls came again, closer this time, riding the smoke like a promise. Atlas heard it too. He turned toward the narrowing mouth of the valley, where the grass gave way to open ash, and the coyotes would have a clear line of approach. Without a sound, he moved to the shallower part of the bank and planted himself between the cubs and the sound, a grey wall layered onto the fading day. His tusks were not sharp like they once had been, but his sheer size rewrote the shape of the threat. Up above all of this, the sky vibrated with a low, steady thud. Grace's helicopter came in from the west, scouting the fire's edge before dark. From her seat, the landscape was a map of risk, reddish smears of burnt forest, thin ribbons of green, little flags of smoke where new trouble brewed. As she banked over the valley, something out of place tugged at the corner of her vision. "Hang on a second," she murmured, leaning toward her window. Down in the scraped-out bed of a dead creek, a shape moved that did not belong to Idaho at all. Big, round back, long, swinging trunk. For a moment she thought the heat waves were playing tricks on her. Then she saw the 2 tiny figures pressed near its feet, specks of brown against the grey. Her hand went instinctively to the radio. "Base, this is Air 4. Her voice crackled into the busy evening. I don't even know how to say this. I'm over Sector D7, Lower Valley. Looks like an elephant. I repeat, an elephant with 2 small animals, possibly bear cubs near its legs." Static answered first, Then a disbelieving chuckle, then the clipped tone of Dana asking for coordinates. On the ground, oblivious to the sudden attention from the sky, Ash and Ember edged closer to Atlas's front legs as the coyote's chatter faded back into the hills. The last light pooled in the little waterhole, turning it the color of tarnished bronze. When their bellies stopped aching quite so sharply, the exhaustion of too many bad days settled into their bones. They circled once, twice, then curled up together against the damp, cool mud. Atlas shifted his stance, planting his feet so their small bodies fit neatly in the triangle of space between them. The air cooled by a degree or two. Crickets took up a weak, late summer song in the reeds along the empty creek. Far off, a column of smoke thickened, unnoticed for now. In the valley, under the watch of a giant who had chosen, for the moment, to stay, 2 cubs finally slept. The radio at the fire camp crackled constantly near dusk weather updates, hose requests, a missing chainsaw report. Dana could follow 3 conversations at once without thinking, but Grace's voice cut through them like a clean line. There was something in the way the pilot said, "You're not going to believe this," that made Dana set her coffee down and lean over the console. Grace read off the coordinates twice, slow and steady, as if saying them carefully might make the facts behave. An elephant in a dry creek, 2 small animals tucked at its feet. On any other day, it would have sounded like a bad joke. Today, with smoke fingering in from 3 sides of the map, it felt like the kind of problem the world threw at you when you were already tired. Noah was at the big topo map when Dana called him over, her finger already circling the grid square. He listened as Grace described what she'd seen: grey bulk, long trunk, 2 moving brown spots, smaller than yearling deer. His first instinct was to argue with the idea. There were no wild elephants in Idaho. Then he saw the satellite photo taped to the side, a transport route, a note about a lost bull, and the knot in his stomach pulled tight. "In that valley?" he asked quietly. "There's only one way out on foot. South is cliff. West is thick timber, already half torched. East, that's the old service road and the research ponds." The word ponds hung in the air. Everyone at the table knew the other feature on that stretch of creek, an aging wooden dam thrown up decades ago by a logging outfit that had long since moved on. Up in the hills, dry heat had been chewing at that dam all summer. The pond behind it had shrunk to a shallow, murky dish, but the structure still held back a burden of mud and water waiting for a reason to move. Lightning-struck snags burned on the ridge above it now, dropping embers toward the slope. If the fire pushed just right, a few timbers could go up like matchsticks. "So we've got fire coming down from the west," Dana said, drawing a red finger along the contour lines, "and a rotten dam above their heads. If that thing goes while they're still in the channel—" She didn't finish. She didn't have to. Noah could picture it clearly enough. A wall of dirty water and debris roaring through the very place the elephant had chosen as a refuge. Miguel Alvarez, one of the younger crew bosses, hovered at the edge of the group, helmet still under his arm. He'd grown up in Idaho, hunting and fishing these ridges, and the idea of an elephant standing over bear cubs in his home mountains felt like a story told at the wrong altitude. "Can't we just chopper it out?" he asked. "Sedate it? Sling it?" Hannah, the district vet who'd arrived that afternoon to consult on livestock evacuations, shook her head. "You knock a 6-ton animal down in rough country with fire nearby, you'd better be sure you can get to him before he stops breathing. And if those cubs are bonded to him already, separating them could panic all 3. I'd rather we move them on their feet if we can." Dana stared at the map, then at the smoke forecast pinned beside it. The wind was supposed to shift overnight, pushing the fire squarely toward that valley. They had hours, not days. "All right," she said finally. "We can't fence the whole world, but we can give them a decent exit ramp." She tapped the thin grey line of the old service road. "We scrape a corridor from that creek to the ponds and meet them there." Within minutes, the camp changed shape. A dozer crew was reassigned, its big yellow machine rumbling toward the ridge to widen and smooth the service track into something a frightened elephant might choose instead of thick brush. Sawyers grabbed their gear, ready to drop any half-burnt snags leaning over the route. Miguel was told to ride point with a small squad, helmet cam activated, both to scout and, if he was honest, to witness. Down in the failing light of the valley, Atlas shifted as Ash and Ember stirred from their exhausted sleep. The air tasted different again. Under the coolness of evening lay a new, resinous sting. Somewhere upslope, a tree went down with a heavy crack and a whoosh that didn't sound quite like wind. Ghosts of ember light flickered briefly against the smoke before dying out. Ash stood, legs stiff, and tested the air the way his mother once had nose up, tasting for danger without understanding the words. Ember pressed against Atlas's front leg, small claws catching in the rough skin. The little pool they drank from had settled into stillness, but it no longer felt like a place to stay. The creek bed that had once beckoned now felt like a narrow hallway with something dangerous at one end. Atlas rumbled low in his chest, a sound that settled the cubs even if they didn't know why. He turned his head east, toward the thinning trees and the old road beyond them. He didn't know there were humans moving machines on his behalf. He only knew the slope lifted more gently there, and the night air carried, beneath the smoke, a faint breath of open water from somewhere farther down. He stepped out of the channel first, hauling his weight up the crumbling bank. Loose dirt slid under his feet, sending small rocks clattering. Ash scrambled after him, slipping, catching himself against roots. Ember came last, panting, eyes bright with a mix of fear and stubbornness. Above them, toward the hidden dam, the fire's glow grew a little stronger, painting the undersides of the clouds a dull, warning orange. The old service road met them as a pale ribbon cutting through the dark timber. Grass had been scraped back, stumps shaved low, fresh sawdust still clinging to the dirt. To Atlas it smelled of machines and men, but it also smelled like passage, a line of least resistance leading away from the tightening ring of smoke. Ash trotted just ahead of his brother now, following the big grey shape the way he once followed his mother. Ember kept so close to Atlas's back leg that his whiskers brushed the deep creases in the elephant's skin. Every few steps he glanced over his shoulder at the gloom they'd left, half expecting it to reach out and pull them back. A low rumble rolled past them, more felt than heard. Down the road, at a respectful distance, Miguel's truck idled with its lights dimmed. Beside it, Noah and Hannah stood shoulder to shoulder, helmets off, watching the trio move toward them. Behind the windshield, a small camera on Miguel's gear winked red, faithfully recording every uncertain step. Between the trees at the far end of the corridor, a fence glimmered in the failing light, tall, chain-link, topped not with barbed wire, but with fluttering strips of survey tape. A metal gate stood open. Just inside, a blast of green broke the brown monotony. A research pond, a fringe of cattails, grass that had not yet had reason to die. Off to one side of the gate sat the transport crate, backed up from the road like a horse trailer with its mouth open. Fresh hay padded the floor inside. Apples and sweet feed lay scattered like an invitation. The steel frame gleamed with new paint and heavy hinges. It was, by any professional measure, a promise of safety. To a creature with a long memory, it looked very much like a door. Monica Harris, the sanctuary director, stood near the crate with her hands empty and her heart in her throat. She had flown in that afternoon, the moment she heard there was a bull loose with a torn old collar and a story that matched one of her missing files. Seeing Atlas in the flesh, now thinner, scarred, but very much alive, made her feel both relieved and a little ashamed. "Look at his shoulder," Hannah murmured, nodding toward the strip of leather half buried in thickened skin. The collar he'd once worn had been meant to mark him for protection, but years of friction had dug its own wound. The vet lifted the tranquilizer rifle to her shoulder, then lowered it again. "I don't want to drop him, not with those cubs tucked under him." Noah glanced at the distant line of fire licking along the ridge, then at the cubs weaving between Atlas's legs. "We don't have to," he said softly. "There's a dose we use in the field. Won't knock him out, just take the edge off the pain so we can cut that thing away." Dana, listening in, gave a tight nod. "Do it quick," she said. "Wind's not going to stay gentle." Atlas slowed as the scent of metal and hay reached him, stirring old ghosts. The open mouth of the crate waited, dark and lined with comfort. Beyond it, through the panels of the fence, he could see the shimmer of water and the long sweep of a meadow that bent into more trees, more unknown. Ash and Ember pressed in close, their small bodies warm against his foreleg. A soft thwip cut through the quiet. Something stung his shoulder like a wasp. Atlas flinched, trunk snapping up, but Hannah's dart had landed exactly where she meant it to. She stood very still, hands visible, letting the drug move slowly through miles of muscle. Minutes stretched long. The ache in his joints dulled. The hot pinch where the collar had rubbed for years began to loosen its grip. Hannah moved then, calm and deliberate, a long-handled tool in one gloved hand. "Easy, big guy," she murmured, voice low as a lullaby. Ash huffed. Uncertain, but Ember only watched, nose twitching, with 3 careful cuts and one hard pull that made every human watching wince. The leather finally parted. The old band dropped into the dust with a heavy, ugly thud. Beneath it, the skin was raw and ridged, angry in places, healing in others. Hannah sprayed a cool mist of medicine over the wound, the droplets catching the last light. Atlas shivered once, then stilled, as if feeling, truly feeling, the lack of weight for the first time. Noah bent to pick up the collar. Rust flaked off under his fingers. The tag numbers, half worn, matched the ones in Monica's memory. Monica stepped forward just enough that Atlas could see her, hands still open, eyes bright with unspilled tears. "We tried to bring you home once," she whispered, though everyone knew he wouldn't understand the words. "We lost you in the smoke, and somehow you found these 2 instead." Her gaze shifted briefly to the crate, then to the gap in the fence, where the corridor continued like an unfinished sentence. For a stretched, fragile moment, every possibility lay in front of him. If he stepped into the crate, the doors would close and the world would shrink to the size of a trailer again, only this time it would lead to pasture and reliable water, to a life within fences but free of bullets and bad roads. If he turned away, he would be choosing something messier. Open country, fire seasons, and the quiet responsibility of 2 small shadows who now refused to leave his side. Ash nudged Ember toward the crate first, drawn by the sweet bite of apple on the air. Ember took 2 hesitant steps in that direction, then stopped, ears tilting toward the softer sounds, the frogs beginning to call from the research pond, the night insects buzzing in the grass beyond the fence. Behind him, he could feel Atlas's breath, slow and steady, waiting. At last, Atlas moved. Not with the quick, frightened lunge of an animal driven, but with the careful weight of someone casting a vote. He reached his trunk into the crate, touched the hay, the apples, the cool shadow of enclosed space. Then he turned his head aside, letting his trunk slide instead along the open gap in the fence, over the worn earth of the makeshift corridor that led out to the broader valley. He swung that same trunk back down and rested it for a heartbeat across Ember's shoulders, the way a hand might rest lightly on a child's back. Then he stepped forward through the open gate, away from the steel and toward the rough line the dozer had carved through brush and rock. Ash and Ember went with him without looking back, paws quickening to stay near his feet. No one cheered. The choice was too big for noise. Monica pressed the heel of her hand against her chest, feeling something tight inside her unclench and rearrange. "Then we go with him," she said quietly to Dana and Noah. "We protect the path he chose, not the one we planned." Behind them, Hannah bent to do. Lift the fallen collar into a bag, as if burying an old idea. The sun slipped below the ridge, turning the smoke above them to a gentle, bruised purple. Ahead, the corridor curved with the lay of the land, leading toward low meadows and safer water. Trucks idled into motion again, not to chase, but to shadow at a distance. In the growing twilight, an elephant and 2 bear cubs walked side by side into a future no one had drawn on the map, leaving the open crate behind like a question they had answered together. By the time night folded over the corridor, the worst of the fire had turned away. Crews had cut black lines and wet lines, persuading the flames to climb a different ridge. Down in the low country, where the land gentled out, Atlas stepped off the scraped path and into grass that brushed his ankles instead of ash. Ash and Ember disappeared up to their bellies in green for the first time in days. They found the research pond not by sight, but by sound, the small steady lap of water against a muddy bank. It was ringed with cattails and hard used by deer and elk, but it was still water, cool and patient. Atlas tested the edge with 1 foot, then waded in until it lapped at his knees. When he drew his trunk full and blew a curtain of droplets over the cubs, both bears flinched, then shook themselves and made small offended noises that sounded almost like laughter. A little way back, the convoy of trucks stopped at the new fence line the crews had thrown up in a wide arc, more to keep people out than animals in. Dana shut off her engine and let the quiet roll in. Over the hood, she could just make out the hulking shape of Atlas near the pond, the 2 small smudges of motion at his feet. For the first time in several exhausting days, the knot between her shoulders loosened. Noah stood beside her, notebook in hand, but he didn't bother to write. Some things, he decided, were better stored in the soft tissue of memory than flattened into ink. "We'll need permanent signage," he said eventually, half to himself. "No motorized vehicles down here, no target shooting. We can build them a real corridor, not just a fire line." Dana grunted her agreement. The plan had already begun to grow roots. Back at camp, under a floodlight strung between 2 trailers, a young communications tech named Zoe scrolled through Miguel's helmet footage. She'd been sent to pull a few stills for the incident report, but what flashed across her screen made her forget the form's boxes. Frame after frame showed a grey giant moving through smoke, 2 cubs pressed against his legs like shadows that refused to stay behind. She stopped on one clip and played it twice. In it, a burning snag crashed behind them, sparks shooting into the air. Atlas didn't bolt. He simply turned, placing himself squarely between the falling tree and the cubs, dust and ash billowing around his silhouette. Even with the wind and radio chatter in the background, Zoe could hear Ember's thin cry and Ash's answering huff of courage. Her throat tightened. On impulse, she clipped a 30-second section and added a single line of text. In the middle of the Idaho fires, one elephant chose to protect 2 orphaned bear cubs. She meant to send it to the internal drive, but habit and muscle memory betrayed her. Her thumb hit share, instead of save, and within minutes the clip left the safety of the fire camp's network and slipped into the wide, unruly world beyond. It didn't go quietly. By dawn, a local reporter had picked it up, then a regional outlet, then a national one. The comments piled up faster than Zoe could read them. People in city apartments and farmhouses and hospital waiting rooms watched over and over as Atlas shielded the cubs, as they drank from the muddy pool he'd dug, as they crossed that improvised corridor together. More than a few admitted, simply, "This made me cry." Up in the valley, far from the hum of phones and headlines, life settled into something like a rhythm. The crews finished their work and pulled back, leaving behind a scatter of new water troughs tucked under willow clumps and a map full of red circles marked "No Disturbance." Monica worked with landowners and agencies to turn an emergency path into a permanent wildlife passage, a phrase that tasted better in her mouth than capture plan ever had. Trail cameras sprouted discreetly along the corridor, set low and quiet. One cool morning a few weeks later, one of them blinked awake as Atlas eased a shoulder against a downed cottonwood, lowering the trunk so Ash and Ember could clamber up the tilted trunk. Ash charged ahead, slipping, then regaining his footing higher on the log. Ember dangled for a moment, then found his balance, encouraged by a gentle nudge from a grey trunk beneath him. That still image elephant steady as a stone, two bear cubs halfway to bravery on the fallen tree, became the one editors fought to use. It was printed in newspapers, slid into evening news packages, shared across feeds with captions that ranged from earnest to clumsy. The story shapes were all different, but the core stayed the same. In a burned summer, something soft and stubborn had refused to burn. For Ash and Ember, there were no headlines, only days that gradually stopped hurting. Their coats grew thicker, their steps turned from weary shuffles back into clumsy, joyful bounds. They learned which part of the valley held late berries, which hollow stayed cool when the sun hit hard. At night, when coyotes called from the far hills, they slept in the lee of Atlas's forelegs, the drum of his slow breathing louder than any distant threat. Atlas's wound across his shoulder healed in its own time, the skin knitting over but leaving a pale, scalloped scar where the collar once sat. Rangers came now and then with long poles and patient hands, offering medicine from a respectful distance, when flies worried the old injury. He tolerated their presence the way he now tolerated the occasional distant thrum of a helicopter as part of the landscape. Neither trusted nor entirely feared. His real circle, the one he measured his days by, was much closer. On a clear morning in early fall, Noah hiked to a rise above the corridor and sat alone, watching the trio move along the meadow's edge. Ash darted ahead to investigate a stump. Ember stayed close enough to brush against Atlas's leg with every third step. The elephant paused, lifted his trunk, and let out a low, contented rumble that rolled up the hill like distant thunder. Noah felt it in his ribs more than in his ears. "Sometimes," he said softly to the empty air, "hope looks exactly like this, and nothing like what we planned." Behind him, signs on posts and lines on maps and quiet agreements in offices would continue doing their work, keeping motorbikes out, keeping water in, keeping distance where it needed to be. But down in the grass, none of that mattered. There was only a giant who had chosen to walk with two small lives, and a valley that had learned, for once, to make room. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to hear from you. Just drop a simple 0 or 1 in the comments so I know you were here and felt something tonight. And if you want more real, emotional stories like this, stories of courage, kindness, and the unexpected bonds in our world, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. We've got many more powerful journeys coming your way. and I'd be grateful to have you with us for the next chapter.
If this story touched your heart, I'd love to hear from you. Just drop a simple 0 or a 1 in the comments so I know you were here and felt something tonight.